Coming up on the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson. 2 ships have collided in the North Sea. As they continue to burn, there are fears of an environmental disaster. So how bad could it get?
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kelnick.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
Solong has collided with tanker Stena Immaculate in the outer anchorage. Both vessels are abandoning.
Just before 10 on Monday morning, the cargo ship Solong crashed into the Stena Immaculate, an oil tanker that was anchored off the coast of East Yorkshire. Now, thankfully, all but one of the crew on board the vessels were recovered, but attention obviously now turns to the potential environmental effects, and they could be catastrophic. Thomas Moore is our science correspondent, and he joins us from England's East Coast. But you might be better placed to tell us specifically where you are, Thomas, and why.
I am at the RSPB Reserve at Bempton Cliffs. It's extremely windy. It's very important for nesting seabirds. 500,000 will be gathering here along these cliffs. It's about 100 metres down to the sea here. The waves are really beginning to pick up as the wind blows in from the north. Now, over on the horizon is the site of the collision. We can't see it from here, but of course these seabirds are feeding far out to sea as they prepare to have their young in the next few weeks. So this is an area where people are very concerned about the impact that this disaster could have on wildlife.
Talk to me about these 2 vessels, the Solong and the Stena Immaculate, because a lot of the environmental concerns stem not just from the fuel that they would be carrying to power the ships, of course, but what they were carrying as cargo.
Yes, indeed. So the tanker was carrying jet fuel or kerosene. That's a very light kind of oil. And it is extremely explosive, which is why we saw an intense fire yesterday. But also, if it gets onto the surface of the water, it tends to evaporate quite quickly. So any environmental consequences would be quite localised around the site of the collision. But there is this other aspect, the heavy fuel oil that powered the ships. Now that's a much stickier, tarry-like fuel, and that does clog the feathers of birds and the fur of seals and so on, and that can cause horrible consequences for them. They can't insulate themselves against the wet and the cold, so hypothermia would be a huge issue for them, as well as, of course, the toxic nature of the oil itself. So this is something that would be a big concern if there was a significant slick that did move towards land. And of course, when you're dealing with birds here, I mean, they nest on these cliffs, but they are feeding miles offshore, and that could be in the area where there might be an oil slick.
There had been concerns that the cargo vessel, the Solong, had been carrying sodium cyanide. Look, any mention of cyanide and people's ears are going to prick up, but that seems to have gone away.
Yes, as we understand it, it may be that there were containers on board that had in the past contained cyanide, and those are being monitored, but there was no bulk quantities of cyanide on board, according to the ship's owners. But what we don't really know is what was in those containers. We don't know the full cargo manifest, and certainly the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency will be going through that very carefully so they can understand what they're up against and what impact that might have for the birds that live here and the seals, the Atlantic grey seals. They've just finished pupping, and they will have young very close to shore, so they too would be vulnerable to any pollution that does come their way.
Just talk a little bit more about this heavy fuel oil, this sticky stuff, as you were mentioning a moment ago. Now, as we understand it, both those vessels remain on fire. So we probably don't have even a rough idea of how much fuel oil might be at risk of leaking into the waters.
Well, that's right. Even when the fire's out, there will be so much hot metal that it will be very dangerous to get too close. And while there remains that potential for further jet fuel leaks and another explosion, they will be very, very careful. But they will want to assess how much is getting into the water. Now, a slick can be seen from the air. We know that the Coast Guard has been flying over the site of the collision, trying to monitor what's needed. They do have booms that they can put in the water, and also dispersal agents that they can spray from the air. They will want to make sure that there is no lingering contamination of the marine environment, because this is a really important fishing area, not least. It is the largest lobster fishery in Europe. So you've got the livelihoods of an awful lot of families that are at stake if there is long-term contamination of the seabed around here.
OK, so let's speak to someone who knows even more than Thomas about the wildlife in the area. David Craven works with the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, and he joins us now. David, this must be your worst nightmare.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of putting it. I mean, I think when I came to work for Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, which is about 7 years ago, one of the things that attracted me was that I was going to come and work with some of the places that I love most, that I've grown up going to since I was a kid, places like Spurn Point and Flamborough Cliffs. And I would have always hoped I would never be in that situation where we were dealing with this sort of spill, this sort of incident where we were worried about exactly what was going to be the impact. But yeah, this is where we find ourselves.
Describe the area to us then, and the wildlife. My son and I have actually been down on the cliffs that we were just speaking to Thomas from atop of. But for those who haven't been to the area, just describe it.
So I think a really good place to start is to talk about Flamborough Cliffs. The actual first piece of conservation legislation that was ever passed anywhere in the entire world was passed in the UK in 1869. It was the Conservation of Seabirds Act, and it was passed to protect the birds that lived at Flamborough Cliffs. That's how important that headland is. It is fundamental to the entire history of conservation of wildlife. And it's so important because basically you get this perfect array of circumstances. What you get is you have the cliffs themselves, which are the perfect home for an array of species, including things like puffin, guillemot, razorbill, gannet, kittiwake, all these coastal specialists. And then off those cliffs, you get nutrient upwelling in the waters, which creates a rich place for small fish like sand eels to live. And that creates the food source that allows those birds to come back every single year and breed and create the next generation. And they are incredibly site-specific. They stay and breed in the same place, come back year after year. We're talking about birds which can live for 15 to 20 years. They can be breeding for 15 plus years. So anything that sort of threatens that environment is really significant, because you are talking about species which are all either threatened or endangered.
How close then is the site of the collision of these two vessels to those parts of the coastline that you're just describing then?
So it's about 20 miles or so off the coast, and then it's a little further south from Flamborough. At the moment, the way we're looking at this and the way we're looking at the sort of wind patterns and the tide patterns and stuff like that, we don't think Flamborough is immediately in any sort of threat itself, because it's going more in a southerly direction. However, fish move over a large patch of water. They don't obey a little line where we may draw sort of protected zones, nature reserves, things like that. Probably more at threat than Flamborough is actually the Humber Estuary and the reserves that we manage, such as Spurn Point, and also that our colleagues at Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust manage down around sort of places like Don and Oak.
We've focused mostly, of course, on the birds so far, but you mentioned the fish in the sea. There's also mammal life in the seas off the coast of England at this part as well.
Yeah, it's an incredibly rich sea. People don't necessarily think of the North Sea as being this sort of wildlife-rich haven, but that is exactly what it is. And as well as all the seabirds, as well as incredible fish nurseries, which depend on things like the kelp forests and the seagrass meadows, you've also got the marine mammals, which we're seeing increasing numbers on the Yorkshire coast. That's gone from sort of the seals, which we've had for quite a long time. We've started to see porpoise coming in. And increasingly now we see every single year, we see dolphins, and we see an array of whale species, from the things we expect to see that we're used to seeing, like the minke whales. We're also seeing these things like humpback whales, for example, which there was one off Scarborough only a couple of weeks ago. So again, anything that's impacting this marine environment is a huge threat to all of these sort of things, because in nature, everything is interconnected. So an influx of toxic material into an environment, it starts at the bottom of the food chain and it works its way up. And what's really concerning is that what we know happens is that the top of that food chain, because they eat so many different things, anything that's maybe in a small quantity in one fish will accumulate in massive quantities in things like marine mammals, which will eat hundreds and thousands of those fish.
So just to be absolutely clear, David, even if this toxic material doesn't make its way all the way to the coastline, there could still be very significant environmental impacts as a result of the crash.
It's certainly possible, yeah. I mean, at the moment, we're all sort of crossing our fingers and really hoping that the speed of the response and the quality of the response is what we think it looks like. And that will hopefully really significantly contain this and mean that we don't get anything like the significance that maybe we were fearing only 24 hours ago. But it's impossible for there not to be some impacts. We're just hoping it's smaller impacts rather than bigger impacts. And maybe something that we feel in a short shock as opposed to the sort of long months of dead birds washing up on a coastline, for example.
So what of the efforts to save as much of the wildlife as possible? Let's head back to Thomas Moore atop Bempton Cliffs. Thomas, who is technically in charge of this operation then?
Well, it would be the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency working with other organisations that would be trying to contain the oil. If the oil does come ashore, if there is a significant quantity, then there are contingency plans that all the wildlife groups along this shore have collaborated on to draw up, and they certainly, I know that they had a meeting last night just to make sure that they were prepared. They can call on a large number of volunteers who would be bringing in oiled birds and seals that were in distress and so on, that they can bring them into these wildlife hospitals. They'd have triage centres where they can be assessed, the numbers can be recorded because that's an important part of the process, but then an attempt will be made to try and get any oil or contaminants off their feathers and restore them to health. And sometimes that's not possible. So sadly, if this is a large pollution event, it's likely that some animals will sadly be euthanised.
It certainly is a possibility, a very strong possibility if the tides turn. I'm just wondering, Thomas, just as a nation, do we have much experience of dealing with cleanups like this? I was racking my brains to try and think of the last time something like this happened.
Well, the last one I can think of was the Brea tanker. I think that was back in the late 1980s, and that was a gasoline. So again, a relatively light oil that it was carrying, so it did evaporate, and even though it was closer to shore than the collision this time, there wasn't too much damage. Some seals did get oil on their fur, but there doesn't seem to have been any long-term contamination of the area, although it was very, very carefully monitored because, again, fisheries were an issue.
I suppose this is probably a how long's a piece of string question, but in terms of a clean-up operation, we won't be talking hours and days, will we?
Well, we don't really know how big this clean-up operation will be, or if there will be one at all. It just depends whether there is a significant amount of pollution. Now, I am being blown from behind. There is a very stiff breeze coming from the north, and according to the Met Office, the waves will increase in height. Now, both those two will tend to help disperse any pollution, but it also push it further down the coast, not necessarily in towards the east coast, towards Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, perhaps further down towards North Norfolk. But where exactly it lands, what's in its way, that's yet to be determined. But people all along this coastline are monitoring wildlife and getting ready should there be a need to bring out all those decontamination procedures.
I suppose what we do take from incidents like this is a reminder of just how dangerous it is for ships to be carrying toxic substances or indeed fuel oil and be involved in a crash so close to shore.
Yes, but then the tanker was due to come into the Humber estuary. That's where it was waiting for its berth. That's why it was anchored. So we all use oil. Now, many people aren't happy about that. But the fact is we rely on our modern lives for oil at the moment as we transition away from that. But it does mean that oil necessarily has to come in offshore. So there is a risk. It's how you reduce that risk so it is acceptable, so situations like this don't happen again in the future.
Thank you, Thomas. That's a lot for this edition of The Daily. We are back again tomorrow.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kelnick.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.